From the corners of dusty garages in Nairobi, a quiet revolution began. Young engineers with limited resources looked at old vehicles and saw new possibilities. They imagined a world where African roads could hum with electric life. It started as a dream whispered among friends who loved machines and believed in change. The first prototypes were not glamorous. They were patched together from scrap, powered by recycled batteries and relentless determination. Every spark of innovation faced the shadows of doubt. People asked why anyone would bother building electric cars in a continent struggling with basic infrastructure. But the vision was bigger than skepticism. In the early days, the movement was invisible to most of the world. A few innovators worked late into the night, their hands blackened with grease, their minds lit with ideas. They were not Silicon Valley giants with billions in funding. They were ordinary Africans with extraordinary belief. In small workshops, welding sparks danced like fireflies in the dark. Every sound of a tightening bolt was a note in a symphony of resilience. The roads outside were filled with combustion engines, noisy and dominant. Yet in those modest spaces, silence was being engineered. Silence that would one day compete with the roar of fuel. The earliest models barely moved beyond the workshop doors. But each failure was fuel for the next attempt. They learned that progress was not a straight road. It was a maze of dead ends, breakthroughs, and relentless pursuit. The challenges were immense. Batteries were expensive, charging stations were non-existent, and investors were hard to find. Still, the pioneers kept building. They believed that Africa could lead a new wave, not follow an old one. Electric mobility was more than technology. It was a statement of independence, sustainability, and innovation. In places like Lagos, Accra, and Kigali, whispers grew louder. University students started projects that defied expectations. Tech hubs emerged as breeding grounds for green dreams. Every innovation told the same story: progress against the odds. Governments were slow to notice. Policies lagged behind ambition. But ambition never waits for permission. These early builders were rewriting the script of African transportation. They saw a future where electric cars were not luxuries, but necessities. A future where clean energy powered mobility and prosperity. The journey from garage to global had begun. And it began with courage. Momentum began to grow like a ripple turning into a wave. The whispers in dusty garages became conversations in boardrooms. What started as tinkering turned into structured projects. Tech entrepreneurs started asking hard questions about scalability. Could these prototypes survive the harsh roads of Africa? Could they handle the unpredictable power supply? The innovators believed they could. They had always lived with scarcity, and scarcity breeds creativity. Charging infrastructure was the first mountain to climb. In cities where electricity blackouts were common, charging an EV seemed like science fiction. But that obstacle sparked another idea. If the grid was unreliable, then why not make EVs work off-grid? Solar power emerged as the silent partner in this revolution. Sunlight had always been Africa's gift, abundant and relentless. Now it was being harnessed to power movement. Startups began experimenting with solar charging stations. In rural areas, where fuel was expensive and scarce, solar EV hubs made perfect sense. Villages that once depended on imported fuel saw a new kind of independence. Electric mobility was not just an urban luxury anymore. It was becoming a rural necessity. The first solar-powered charging points were humble. Wooden frames held panels that soaked in sunlight. Small batteries stored power for a few scooters or a single car. But the symbolism was enormous. It meant Africa could leapfrog the fossil fuel trap. It meant mobility could be clean, affordable, and locally powered. Investors began to notice the potential. At first, they were cautious, treating EV startups like risky bets. But success stories have a way of multiplying interest. One successful pilot program in Kenya sparked curiosity across the continent. Motorbike taxis, known as boda bodas, became the front line of electrification. They were everywhere, carrying people and goods through congested streets. Switching them to electric was a game changer. Startups like Opabus and Ampersand started making headlines. They proved that electric mobility was not just possible but profitable. A single converted motorbike could cut fuel costs by half. For riders, this meant more income and fewer trips to fuel stations. Word spread like wildfire among riders. The economics made sense, and so did the sustainability. Every electric boda boda on the road was a rolling advertisement. People stared when they heard no engine noise. They asked questions, and curiosity turned into demand. Governments could no longer ignore the trend. Regulators started drafting policies for electric mobility. Tax incentives and reduced import duties for EV components began appearing. What was once a fringe experiment became a national conversation. But challenges persisted. Battery costs were still high. The lack of local battery production meant dependency on imports. Supply chains were fragile, and shipping delays hurt businesses. Yet, every obstacle forced innovation. Some startups turned to battery swapping to solve the problem. Instead of waiting hours to charge, riders could swap a dead battery for a charged one in minutes. Battery swapping stations popped up in busy neighborhoods. It felt like a futuristic idea, but it was rooted in practical need. This innovation was uniquely African in its resilience. It did not copy the West. It created a new model for the world. By now, the EV wave was unstoppable. Tech conferences in Nairobi, Kigali, and Lagos buzzed with discussions on electrification. Global automakers began paying attention. They saw Africa not just as a consumer market, but as an innovation hub. Some of them started partnerships with local startups. Others sent teams to study the unique conditions shaping Africa's EV boom. The streets began to change slowly. Where smoke once filled the air, quiet motion replaced chaos. Children playing by the roadside noticed the difference. No roaring engines, no choking fumes, just smooth, silent rides. The shift was cultural as much as technological. People started associating electric mobility with progress and pride. In music videos, electric motorbikes began to appear as symbols of modernity. Influencers promoted clean rides as lifestyle choices. The revolution was no longer confined to engineers and entrepreneurs. It had entered the mainstream consciousness. And with consciousness came capital. Big investors from Europe, Asia, and America started knocking on doors. They saw Africa as the next frontier for clean transportation. Venture capital flowed into EV startups like never before. Local entrepreneurs who once struggled for seed money now had multiple offers. But money was not the only factor driving this change. Passion remained at the heart of it all. Those who started this movement in garages still believed in its soul. They wanted to ensure that electrification was inclusive, not elitist. They dreamed of affordable EVs for everyday Africans, not just luxury cars for the wealthy. And that dream was slowly turning real. Prices began to fall as production scaled. New assembly plants were being planned across East and West Africa. Local manufacturing was no longer a fantasy. It was happening. Governments began signing agreements for EV assembly lines. Every announcement was another brick in the road to global relevance. Africa was not waiting anymore. It was moving, and the world had to notice. What started as a whisper in garages was now an echo across continents. And this was only the beginning. Factories began to rise where once there were only fields and small warehouses. The sound of welding now echoed in large assembly plants. For the first time, Africa was not just importing cars but building its own electric fleet. Local assembly meant more than just jobs. It meant knowledge transfer, skill development, and industrial confidence. Technicians who once fixed old fuel engines were retraining to work on electric drivetrains. Universities began offering courses in battery technology and EV engineering. The education system slowly adapted to meet the demands of a changing industry. Graduates who once dreamed of working abroad now saw opportunities at home. This was a new kind of pride, a technological pride rooted in African soil. Countries started competing to attract EV investment. Kenya offered tax holidays for EV assembly plants. Rwanda positioned itself as a clean energy hub with green mobility policies. Nigeria leveraged its massive market to lure global automakers. Each government wanted a piece of the future. Policies that once favored fuel imports now shifted toward electric incentives. Charging infrastructure became a national agenda. Plans for thousands of charging stations spread across major highways. Cities began zoning areas for electric taxis and buses. Urban planners envisioned roads where silence replaced smog. But infrastructure was still a race against time. Population growth and urban congestion demanded quick solutions. Public transport was the next frontier for electrification. Electric buses rolled out in pilot programs across major cities. The reaction was overwhelming. Commuters loved the comfort and quiet of these buses. Operators loved the reduced fuel costs and maintenance savings. Electric buses became moving billboards for the EV revolution. Every ride was a message. The future is here. Private companies joined hands with governments to scale the rollout. International donors funded green mobility projects to reduce carbon emissions. Climate organizations cheered as African cities embraced sustainability. The global narrative began to change. Africa was no longer just a victim of climate change. It was becoming a leader in climate action. This leadership was not symbolic. It was practical and profitable. Local entrepreneurs who once hustled in small garages were now CEOs of thriving companies. Their stories became case studies in innovation and resilience. Magazines featured them as icons of African ingenuity. Global conferences invited them to share their journey. They spoke of challenges, but they also spoke of hope. Hope that an entire continent could redefine mobility on its own terms. Meanwhile, international automakers faced a choice. Either ignore Africa and risk being left out, or join hands and grow together. Many chose the latter. Partnerships bloomed between global giants and African startups. Technology flowed in, but so did respect for local ideas. The African EV model was unique, shaped by real-world challenges. It was not about luxury sedans on perfect highways. It was about rugged vehicles for rough roads. It was about affordability and adaptability. Global automakers learned as much as they taught. Battery technology was a constant conversation. Local startups wanted smaller, swappable batteries for two-wheelers and three-wheelers. Big companies wanted to standardize. But Africa insisted on flexibility. Flexibility was survival in a land of unpredictable grids and long distances. And survival had always been Africa's strength. While big debates raged, small victories multiplied. Every electric boda saved a rider money. Every electric bus saved a city air pollution. Every solar charging station brought energy independence to rural areas. The ripple effect was massive. Jobs were being created not just in factories but in entire ecosystems. Battery swapping attendants, solar panel installers, EV mechanics, all became part of the new economy. The informal sector embraced electrification too. Street mechanics who once rebuilt engines now repaired electric motors. Innovation trickled down to the grassroots. People designed low-cost charging solutions using recycled solar panels. Entrepreneurs sold mobile power banks for electric scooters. Every street corner became a small node in the green revolution. Meanwhile, data told a powerful story. Fuel imports began to decline in countries with strong EV adoption. Foreign exchange savings boosted national economies. Cities reported lower noise and air pollution levels. Health experts predicted long-term benefits from cleaner air. The EV wave was no longer just about mobility. It was about economic resilience, energy security, and public health. This narrative caught the attention of global media. Stories appeared in major newspapers, describing Africa's quiet transformation. Investors who once hesitated now rushed to get in early. Billions of dollars flowed into green mobility projects. Some called it the new gold rush. But unlike the old rushes that drained Africa, this one built it up. The wealth stayed longer because it was tied to infrastructure, technology, and skills. This was not extraction. This was creation. And it was just accelerating. The dream of a Pan-African EV network started taking shape. Leaders envisioned highways lined with fast chargers from Cairo to Cape Town. They spoke of a future where trade moved on clean energy. Regional trade blocs discussed harmonizing EV regulations. Standards for charging, battery safety, and recycling were debated. The African Union placed electric mobility on its agenda. What started in garages was now on continental tables of power. The shift was irreversible. And yet, the pioneers never forgot where it began. They still remembered those nights of trial and error. They remembered when people laughed at the idea of an African electric car. Now those same people rode electric taxis and took selfies with charging stations. Progress had silenced doubt more effectively than words ever could. And the story was still unfolding. Global headlines began to showcase Africa as an unexpected EV powerhouse. Analysts who once dismissed the continent as a passive consumer were now recalculating forecasts. Reports from think tanks spoke of Africa as the next big EV growth market. They highlighted how African startups had solved problems others ignored. Battery swapping was now being studied in Europe as a scalable model. Western cities envied Africa's fast adoption of electric motorcycles. The script had flipped. Innovation no longer flowed in one direction. For decades, Africa imported ideas, but now it was exporting them. The world was learning from Africa's constraints and creativity. Global conferences invited African CEOs to keynote sessions. They spoke of resilience as an engine of innovation. They explained how scarcity had become a laboratory for breakthrough ideas. Investors listened and took notes.